Hello there, my name is Christopher Pryor and I'm a lecturer in Imperial History at the University of Leeds. And today's topic for discussion is the actions of Britain in Africa. The question that's going to be examined today is, were strategic or economic motives the more important factor in explaining Britain's involvement in Africa during the period from 1868 to 1902? We're going to be looking at what is commonly known as the Scramble for Africa, the process in the later decades of the 19th century whereby most of Africa came under the rule of one of a number of European powers, amongst whom Britain, France and Germany were the biggest players. To assess the importance of different factors, I'm going to split today's talk up into three obvious parts. Firstly, I'm going to look at the strategic importance of Africa. Secondly, I'm going to look at the economic importance of Africa. And then thirdly, I'm going to offer up some conclusions as to which of these two I think the most important. In terms of strategy, Africa had proven of some importance throughout the 19th century. Before the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, it was felt useful to have a series of ports along the coast of Africa so that British ships bound for India would have places to stop at along the way. You have some of these in West Africa in particular. Some of this desire for such coastal ports was based on strategic military considerations. It was felt that having coastal ports in Africa would make it easier for Britain to fight her wars anywhere in the world. After all, the Cape Colony, the southernmost part of South Africa, had been seized during the Napoleonic Wars. This had been partly to ensure that soldiers bound for India or headed back from India to Europe had a place to stop off and replenish supplies along the way. Moving into the post-1868 period, Britain wanted to retain its influence in European diplomatic affairs to help keep the relative peace that, with the exception of certain conflicts like the Crimean War, had more or less prevailed since the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. Britain wanted to look strong in the eyes of her European neighbours, and having a large empire was viewed as a good means of doing this. The prominent Cambridge historian Ronald Higham has argued that it was the French and Germans who started off the scramble for Africa. The French, the line goes, were pushing more aggressively into markets in West Africa, while Otto von Bismarck, the so-called Iron Chancellor of a newly united Germany, sought to carve out territories, particularly in the east and the southwest of the continent. Closely connected to this, as African colonies were sought as a prerequisite for national prestige and international standing, we have something of a domino effect. Some historians have argued that, as one European state ventured into new territory and stated a claim, so another followed suit, and another, and so on. The fear of exclusion, of losing out, was powerful. This is the line pursued by A.J.P. Taylor. He has argued that the scramble for Africa was merely European rivalries writ large on a different screen. Taylor also argues that the scramble was a bit of a pressure valve, because it meant that the different emerging powers could rival one another in an area that wasn't Europe, where the damage of such rivalries would have been even greater. One of the biggest fears that the British had regarding the stability of the Raj was that Russia would invade via Afghanistan and into northwest India. If you've ever read Kim by Rudyard Kipling, you'll know that this was called the Great Game. The espionage and diplomatic intrigues, and sometimes outright warfare that was pursued by the British to prevent their border from being threatened. It was felt that British control of the Suez Canal would allow for a speedier dispatch of troops from Britain to India in the event of any conflict with either the Russians or any of the Afghan peoples, and for a speedier movement of communications between India and Britain, enabling the British to be kept updated more rapidly on any events that threatened her and to be able to issue a response accordingly. Furthermore, if you were a follower of Benjamin Disraeli's thinking, Britain's having an influence in the Mediterranean, such as that afforded by having a presence in the Canal Zone, would mean that Britain could do her best to see that the integrity of the Ottoman Empire could be maintained as a buffer against any Russian expansion into the Middle East and southeastern Europe. While there have been some historians, like Hyam and Taylor, who have argued that strategic considerations were of the utmost importance in accounting for a growing British presence in Africa, far more have argued that economics was the most significant factor. Two prominent historians, Peter Kane and A.G. Hopkins, have taken issue with the idea that international rivalry, and more specifically considerations of international prestige, caused the scramble. For them, all of this talk of domino effects is piffle. They argue that historians have just got themselves tangled up with lots of finger pointing, namely that British historians tend to blame the French for the scramble, the French often blame the Belgians and the Germans, while the Germans and the Belgians often blame the French and the British. Instead, Kane and Hopkins argue that what was of real importance was economics, and more specifically, finance. For them, it was the great European financiers who caused the massive continent of Africa to be chopped up into pieces, rather than the politicians. They see the late 1860s and early 1870s as the point at which financiers, the people who make a profit from investments and from money lending, they decided Africa was of potential use to them. The government of Britain and the various other European governments then felt that following such people was in their best national interests, so they went along with this, according to Kane and Hopkins' line of argument. And this is also in keeping with what various other historians have argued and various other critics of the time as well. For instance, you have the turn-of-the-century critic of empire, the radical liberal J.A. Hobson. He believed that it was the flag that followed the capitalists. But the economic argument doesn't merely stretch to financiers. Particularly from the 1870s and 1880s onwards, there was a growing awareness from some in Britain that America and Germany were developing industrially. America was starting to restabilise economically following the end of the Civil War, leading to a growth in its cotton exports. And by the last quarter of the 19th century, most of Western Europe, and Germany in particular, was producing seriously cheap goods, and competition for markets was increasing dramatically. Saturated home markets led European merchants to seek new markets abroad, and Africa appeared to offer fine hunting grounds. With heightened competition, free trade gave way to protectionism. The other European nations established their colonies and territories as closed markets, from which rival powers could be excluded, or at least heavily taxed. In this light, there seems to be a good case to be made that the British took part in the scramble because they thought that if they didn't, this might lead to economic weakness in the future as other European powers benefited from new markets. It's certainly the case that economics was used as a very important justification for acquisition. As huge areas were claimed and marked out, there was a really powerful sense amongst many that deep in the African interior there existed vast untapped wealth and endless raw materials. For instance, popular fiction, you've got Rider Haggard's King Solomon's Mines of 1885, for instance. It contained the idea that deep in the African interior there were caves filled with diamonds and other precious things. These, the stories went, had lain there for centuries, basically just awaiting an Englishman to come and take them. This excited the European imagination, even if privately some statesmen were a bit more sceptical about finding anything of value in these vast new colonies they were suddenly acquiring. Still, nevertheless, novelists and journalists, along with many geologists, geographers, and the other explorers, had fired the imaginations of many. Even Rider Haggard himself believed in the future potential of Africa, investing in a mining company in Sudan. The existence of such untapped wealth was already suggested by the oil of the coastal West African forests, the rubber of the Central African tropical forests, and the diamonds and gold that were found in South Africa. Thus, the idea of Africa's potential led many to speculate wildly on the huge future profitability of the African colonies. However, as we now try and move towards an assessment of which of these two were the more important, the strategic or the economic, you could potentially argue that the economic theory doesn't work because the British and others didn't get a huge amount out of Africa. It's certainly the case that Africa was not as profitable to Britain in the 19th century as, say, Canada or even Argentina, a place which wasn't formally colonised by the British, but was nevertheless part of what was called the informal empire of the 19th century.